in the 1990s. This evening, I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker. Maria Kurbach received her PhD in World History in 2013. She worked as a senior fellow at the Institute of World History of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. She was also a lecturer at the Higher School of Economics at the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. In 2022, after Russia launched the war in Ukraine, Dr. Kurbach emigrated from Russia. She received a scholarship from the Scholar Rescue Fund and is currently a postdoc associate in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at WashU. Dr. Kurbach will present on Eurasianism from Bookish philosophy to official ideology of Putin's Russia. Got two talks that are Putin's Russia.
Thank you, Nicole, for the introduction, and thank you, Taber and the Global Studies for giving me this opportunity to present today. I really appreciate and thank everyone for coming today. Well, as Nicole mentioned, I had been a lecturer at the High School of Economics for years, and one of the courses I taught was called International Conflicts and Peacemaking. And at the beginning of this course, I talked about the general reasons for starting conflicts. And among others, I listed religious and ideological confrontations. And at that time, some of my students laughed, and they just couldn't believe that it's still actual for the conflicts in the 21st century. They could imagine wars started because of resources or something else, because of economic, but they just couldn't believe that someone could start the war because of different religious or ideologies. And here we are now. So we are witnessing the Russian-Ukrainian war and the conflict between Hamas and Israel, where religious and ideological and different national narratives play essential role. And today I will speak about a particular ideology, Eurasianism, and how it emerged as a philosophy and re-emerged as an ideology. And in these terms, I would like all of us as academics, as researchers and lecturers, to think about our responsibilities for what we are writing about and what we are creating, and how our intellectual heritage can be potentially used and affect the real life. Today, I will show how the philosophy that initially was supposed to be a subject for intellectual debates was turned into an ideology of actual war, aggression, blood, and death. So here is shortly the structure of my talk, and I think that it will take around 45 minutes, and then we will have some minutes for questions and discussion. So Russian intellectuals started to contemplate the need to define and to defend the unique nature of their civilization in the mid-19th century, from well-known philosophical duel between Slavophiles and Westernizers. And since then, all Russian thinkers have fallen within the scope of one of these two philosophical trends. And I will not go into details about Slavophiles and Westernizers because they have affected the Eurasianists only implicitly, but in two words, this debate between Slavophiles and Westernizers was launched by the publication of philosophical letters by Pyotr Chadaev in 1836. And so both Westernizers and Slavophiles found a source of inspiration in this writing. But Westernizers associated the development of Russia with modernization and Westernization of the country, whereas the Slavophiles associated Russia's future with the quest for Russia's unique identity, its unique way, its unique history, and unique place in the world in general. So, having gone through many modifications and variations, this duality of Russian understandings of the world is still at the center of Russia's intellectual and political life. But the anti-Western aspect of it re-emerged at the beginning of 20th century in the 1920s, 1930s, among Russian intellectuals in exile in Europe. And these intellectuals among whom such theories grew were the intellectuals that had been expelled from Russia by Bolshevik government. So these emigres thought that it was their duty to preserve Russian culture, Russian history for future generation of Russians once they were liberated from Bolshevik power. And this brought back the search for Russian identity. And one particular trend in this search was the Eurasianist movement, which fell within the Slavophil school of thought. Eurasianists saw Russia not as a nation state nor as an empire, but rather a unique Eurasian entity, and experiencing constant hostility from Europe. And Russia, they thought, must unlearn the West. And as opposed to the Western culture, the Eurasianists saw Russia's core values in the communal spirit of its people and in its Orthodox Christianity. Eurasianists also stressed the essential, unbreakable connection between land and nationhood. So now let me say some words about the founding fathers of Eurasianism. I will not mention all of them, just several of them, and their main ideas. So first of them, Nikolai Trubetskoy, who was a linguist, and in the early 1920s, he brought up the idea about the danger of Russia becoming a colony because its economics was destroyed by the Russian Revolution and by the Civil War. So he was convinced that the Asian parts of the Russian Empire were not colonies, but constituted an integral part of the Russian Eurasian entity and culture. He argued for the need for decolonization and the right to national self-determination for Russia. And to achieve this, for the very first time in history of Russian thought, the Eurasianists embraced Russia's only real colonizers, the Mongol Empire, to which Trubetskoy attributed Russian statehood itself. So this was to deny the West and Western values and to dissociate Russia from it, despite its obvious spiritual origins from Christianity, from Christian Greco-Byzantine world. So the Mongol Empire gave Russia its identity and statehood and defined its universality. Oh, it's called Eurasianism and general Eurasian nationalism, and the third one is we and others. And the next person, which is of particular interest to the contemporary Russian and foreigners as well, is Ivan Ilyin. So His writings are often quoted by the Russian authorities, starting with Putin. So nations, according to Ilyin, all had their own, as he thought, special feeling of law and justice, a different character, a different discipline, a different idea of a moral ideal, a different family structures, a different ecclesiality, a different political dream, and a different state instinct. So in 1934, he formulated the Russian national idea, the core of which was the prevalence of the will of the state over the will of the individual. Only the state, he thought, could see what God's will was and could show the people the way to fulfill it. So Ilyin saw Russia as a large Eurasian space inhabited by the Russians and other nations ruled by the Russians. And Ilyin propagated the idea of national dictatorship with an exceptional role of church and military, the purpose of which was defending Russia's Eurasian space from the innumerable enemies who were only waiting for any sign of weakness in Russia in order to dismember it. And the first act of such a dismemberment, he thought, would be the separation of Ukraine and then of the Caucasus from Russia. So I have to mention one more representative of the Eurasianists, who is of special importance for contemporary Russian policy and has been referred by Putin not once. This is Lev Gumilev. In contrast to other Eurasianists who spent years in exile, Gumilev spent years in Gulag. And almost none of his writings, none of his research was published until the 1980s. His main academic interest was the nations and ethnoses. And Gumilev's nations were defined by biology, geography, landscape, and history. History for him was a history of separate ethnoses, and each connected to a particular accommodating landscape and its resulting culture. And like other Eurasianists, Gumilev saw Russia as a separate cultural historical world, which had no connection with the West. And the Russian multi-ethnic super-ethnos, as he put it, or Eurasia, would never be able to repeat the trajectory of the West and replicate its outcomes. As a specialist in Turkey history, Gumilev used his knowledge to prove that Moscow's true roots were in the Golden Horde, so the Mongol state, not in the Christian Kievan Rus. So Gumilev's works are still quite popular in Russia and among Russian academics, and Putin said that he is one of his most favorable writers. But it was gradually overshadowed by the ideas of a new philosophical celebrity, Alexander Dugin. So Dugin began his career as a right-wing nationalist in various groups and sects. It was in the early 1980s, 1990s. But by the beginning of the 2000s, he turned himself into a prominent philosopher and establishment figure. He published his main philosophical work called Foundation of Geopolitics in 1997. The Dugin's geopolitical theory was actually based on the ideas of Harold Mackinder, a British academic. And Mackinder saw the future world as divided between two rival ideological and territorial influences. One was one of America and Britain, whose navies would rule the world's oceans, so it's like ocean nations, and Russia, the heartland of Eurasia, which would control the whole of the Eurasian landmass. So Dugin just expanded and developed Mackinder's ideas, added much venom against the West and presenting his predictions about Russia's global role as its manifest destiny. So Foundations of Geopolitics went through several editions and was translated into different languages. And according to some resources, it was like a textbook for the Academy of Russia's General Staff, as well as for other military institutions in Russia. Perhaps not many Russians managed to read this book because it's like around 600 pages, but Dugin has widely publicized his political views in media on different platforms, social platforms, repeating his message over and over. And he also actively participated in different Russian and international conferences. And he was also invited to present at Johns Hopkins University in 2015. However, at that time, he was primarily known in a narrow circle of academics and researchers, philosophers, and for a wider audience, he was just a buried and boring man, as his colleague Eduard Limonov said. And his efforts to affect state policy seemed in vain at that time. So Western mass media called Dugin Putin's brain far before the war, but it is inaccurate because according to the experts and people who is close to Putin's inner circle, the president was familiar with Dugin's writing pretty superficially, and their context could not be called stable. And the turning point for Putin and Dugin's rapprochement closing was not the beginning of the Ukraine war, but the other event, the murder of Dugin's daughter, Daria Dugina, in August 2022. And this event was presented to Putin as a brazen Western attack on Russian traditionalists and anti-Westernizers. So I would like to emphasize that Daria Dugina supported his father's views in all senses. And still nobody knows who stayed behind her death, her murder. Anyway, after this, Putin got interested in Dugin, sent him a personal telegram expressing sympathy, and awarded Daria with the Medal of Courage. You see this moment on the picture. And soon after that, for the very first time, Putin used one of Dugin's most likable term, Anglo-Saxons, in his speech. And after that, Dugin's visits to the Kremlin became more and more frequent. But Dugin consults not only Putin, but also other representatives of the apparatus of the president. For example, Sergei Kiriyenko, the first deputy chief of staff of the presidential administration of Russia. And Kiriyenko directly quoted Dugin several times. For example, on October 2022, he called for a patriotic war. And he said, Russia has always won all the wars if they were people's wars. We will win this one too. And exactly a month before that, on September 15, 2022, Dugin declared the same in his manifesto called It's Coming. He said, we are a heroic nation. At horrible but great cost, we defeated a terrible enemy more than once or twice in our glorious history, we will win this time too, if only the war against the West this time becomes a people's war, so patriotic war. We win precisely people's wars, wars in which Aegean people awaken to fight. So in the spring 2023, Dugin and his followers received a great amount of money from the Russian Orthodox billionaire Igor Malafeev to create a new institution, the Institute of Tsargrad. Tsargrad literally means the city of Tsar. So Dugin was assigned a head of this institute. And on this institute's website, numerous publications of Eurasianism and the Eurasianist analysis of the current policy can be found. You can see the link to the website. But let's take a look at the main points of Dugin and other current Russian Eurasianists. So the first of them is militant anti-globalism, anti-modernity, anti-liberalism, and anti-rationalism. So this agenda is very popular in Russia, and it was also a basis of the previous Eurasianist writings. But now they are more focused on anti-liberalism. As Dugin stated, the main idea of fighting liberalism is to fight all Western political modernity. That is the enemy. And on July 28th this year, he posted on the need for new repressions and censorship against all liberals, no matter if they are inside or outside Russia. Every liberal is a betrayer, he said. So Russia must break modernity out, and as liberalism is closely tied to modernity. So the next one is decolonization of Russia and of humanity from the tenets of globalized liberal democracy, which, as Dugin claims, is dragging humanity to extinction. So this idea initially came from Ilyine's writings and developed in current circumstances with the focus on both inner decolonization, so cleaning Russia from all Western culture, and also decolonization of other countries, like decolonization of Africa, Asia, again from the Western influence. And the West itself, he thinks, should be decolonized of its modernity and liberated from its liberalism. And the third point is about empire. So empire with unchangeable supreme power, so monarchy, as the only possible form of Russian existence. So basically, our best future is our past. So they call for a return to the Russian Empire of the 19th century, in particular to the time of Nicholas I, when, as they said, patriarchal Christian Russia owned huge territories on 3 continents from Warsaw to California, but it was not a colonial empire, but great Russian civilization. So, and the next point is an inextricate link between the people and the state. So the state has been created by the Russian people, protected and supported by them. So it also refers to Ilyine's idea of the prevalence of the will of the state over the will of a person. So if the state is in danger, people must stand up for it, sacrifice their lives to prove their loyalty to the land and to the state. The next one, Russia as an independent continent, a state world. So Dugin borrowed this idea from Trubetskoy mainly. So, but today, Eurasianists developed it into something different, which reminds Hitler's Lebensraum, living space, more rather than Eurasianism. So in on the Institute of Tsargrad's website, a paper called Thinking of Russia as a Big Space was posted. Let's look at it. It's pretty interesting piece. So here is some quotes from it. Russia needs its big space where we can build or rebuild our empire. And since the empire is not only a natural, but the only possible way of Russia's existence, only if with a big space can we save our civilization and secure our nation's future. And so, but big space is not territories only, it's also about the population. Dugin convinced that the true empire must be autarky. But the problem is that Russia does not have enough people to build an eternal market big enough to live in isolation for long. So even if Russian women will bear 3 or 4 kids starting tomorrow, it will not be enough to fill the demographical hole. So the only decision is expansion. Let's look at here. The answer is on the surface, a post-Soviet space. Now, the population of the Eurasian Economic Community is 190 million, together with Uzbekistan, which is getting closer and closer to the Eurasian Economic Community. It will be 220 million. And after Russia backs Ukraine, or what will rest from it, into its orbit, the population of the Eurasian community will be around 250 million. And that will be enough for a basis of the big space. Okay, next is well-known Russian world as a civilization without any clear borders. So again, this idea came from Ilyin's writings mostly, and together with the concept of a big space, they formed a perfect justification for Russian expansionism. Dugin said, state borders, with a few exceptions, never correspond to the borders of a civilization. Russian world is an outlined historical and cultural region that, with no doubt, belongs to the Russian civilization, even if exists outside the borders of the Russian state. If a conflict breaks out, Russia has all rights to stand up for its civilization, ignoring the borders. Next, connected with this idea, the war as an apotheosis of the Russian historical way. As Dugin said, this is not simply a war. This is not just Putin's decision, but this is a logic of the whole historical way of Russia, which at all stages fought against dependence from the West. Russia will be free or there will be nothing. So for Russia, the West represents an existential threat. Thus, this war of civilizations was meant to be, better sooner than later. And Dugin called Putin to unleash this war after the war in Georgia and then after the annexation of Crimea. And he always supported Putin, but criticized him for his slowness. Putin always decides at the very last moment, he said. And from his point of view, it took too long for Putin to break up with the West, too long for Putin to unleash this war in Ukraine, and too long to carry out the mobilization. And now, as Dugin thinks, Putin delays the total isolation and the total war. And Dugin is convinced that it should be a total war. So everybody must be involved and must sacrifice. This is the only way to win. But as Dugin said, Russia cannot lose this war anyway because of the nuclear war. So, and this weapon can be used in case of Russia's failure because the world cannot exist without Russia. He said Russia will go to the destruction of mankind only if it finds itself on the brink of destruction. If we do not exist, nobody will either. So there is one other feature of Eurasianism, but I will speak about it at the very end of my speech. And now let's take a look at what of this heritage Putin has already taken on board. And in doing so, the most significant is to analyze not Putin's speeches only, but the official documents signed and adapted. So first, the essential one is a new conception of Russia's foreign policy signed by Putin on March 31 this year. So here we can find some familiar ideas and conceptions. For example, Russia is a distinctive state civilization. Paragraph 4. It is a tremendous Eurasian and Euro-Pacific power that consolidated the Russian and other nations who make up the cultural and civilizational foundation of the Russian world. So in this paragraph, we can indicate three Eurasianistic idea together. So Russia as a state civilization with its own cultural and historical way, and the conception of the Russian world. In previous conceptions, Russia had always been described as a part of a Euro-Pacific space, and the necessity of cooperation with both West and East was essential. And now we can see Russia is described as a supreme power of this region and with its unique national interests and national values, separated from any international organizations and their values. And of course, Russian world. This is the central idea that Putin borrowed from Eurasianists. So Russia is described as a center of this Russian world. However, its borders are not recorded. So for instance, the military forces of Russia, as declared, can be used for preventing the attacks on Russia and its allies, for settlement of conflicts, and for protecting Russian citizens living abroad. So every country that has a particular number of Russian people can be potentially considered as a part of Russian civilization and Russian world. Not surprisingly, the concept of the Russian world has become popular since the annexation of Crimea, and Putin referred to it hundreds of times, and he several times said that Russia's borders does not end anywhere. But he also added that it was a joke, but he kept repeating this joke over and over. And this year, when he told this joke during the Valdai Forum, he added that it must be understood in civilizational meaning. So, and he also said around 2 weeks ago during the World Russian People's Council that Russian world is global, and for the very first time he used the term big Russian world. And in fact, the deputy head of the Russian People's Council is Konstantin Malafeev, who is the owner of Tsargrad TV and Institute of Tsargrad. And at the same day when Putin spoke at this meeting, Malafeev said that federation is a Republican euphemism for the wonderful world empire. And federation is a weak empire, he said, and we must become a strong one. And the idea of the Russian world and Russian civilization and Russian big space resonated with a huge Russian audience that dreams of making Russia great again. And I will give you just one more recent example. on October 28th this year in the center of Moscow, during the festival called Tsar War, the artist, he is also a Eurasianist, Alexei Belyaev-Gintov, presented his project called Super New Moscow. And at the beginning of the excursion, he said that the South Russian borders are limited by stable geopolitical entities such as Iran, China, and Turkey, whereas the Western border is unspecified so far. And maybe Germany can be this stable geopolitical unity, and everything up to Germany is under question. So he basically meant that all this territory could potentially be Russian. And as Dugin's daughter said once, the empire is breathing, and that's why it has no borders. And okay, next one, multipolar world. You probably know this term, but it appeared for the very first time in the official document for opposing to the old logic of global domination and neo-colonialism. The next one is opposing the neoliberal ideological values with spiritual, moral, and ethnic values of Russia. There are a lot of our Russian values have been mentioned several times in this document, and by Putin too. And a special role of the Mongols and the Golden Horde in Russian history. It was not mentioned in official documents, but it was brought up by Putin during his speech on November 3rd, 2023, when Putin said that the Golden Horde was better than European colonizers because it didn't impose its language and culture on the people of the conquered territories. Well, I'm not sure that he truly believes in this, and he never mentioned Mongols before, so probably it's just because of current circumstances, the need to emphasize anti-European essence of Russia and express sympathy to, and his love to Eurasian allies. And the other pillar that I called zero-sum game rhetorics or consciousness. So I think that this approach underlies current Russia's policy and the war of civilizations rhetorics, and in many aspects, the current Eurasianism too. So this rhetoric about whether we win or we will not exist at all, the world where compromises or win-win situations and results are impossible. So who needs a world without Russia, as Putin put it in 2008, or as Dugin stated, Russia will be free or there will be nothing. So this consciousness also underlies the conspiracy theories that are very popular in Russian society now. For example, that of a golden million. In anthropology, there is a concept of a limited good that is connected with the zero-sum game. So there is a limited amount of good to go around, and there is an eternal competition for this good. And this approach is typical for traditional societies mostly, and those based on vertical power sharing. But Russia, in many senses, is still a kind of traditional society in the view of the world with limited good, is a part of this national consciousness. The money is limited, and there are transnational corporations who wants to possess all of them. Resources are limited, that's why we should fight for them. The population of the world is limited, so we have to get as many people on our territories as we can. The power is limited too, so as more power we have, the stronger we are. So the world as a fighting for a pie, so we cannot agree for less. And the last thing I want to speak about can probably sound weird and at first glance insignificant. However, it's important if we think about what underlies Putin's policy on a deeper level. It's mysticism. Mysticism frequently accompanies the periods of huge historical changes, disasters, traumas, transitions, and social turmoils. In recent Russian history, there were three massive outbreaks of mysticism: after Russian Revolution, after the collapse of the USSR, and now. And the fathers of Eurasianism were mystics, all of them. I guess all of them, yeah. And many ideological groups and sects that emerged in the 1990s used these works of Eurasianists as mystics as a source of inspiration. And Dugin started his career as a part of a so-called Mamleyev's group, which practiced occultism and mystical rituals in the 1980s, 1990s. And later he was excluded from the fascistic and anti-Semitic group called Pamyat Memory for his occult Satanism in 1989. And mysticism was extremely popular among the Russian authorities in the 1990s and in KGB too. And in Yeltsin's inner circle, there were all sorts of shamans and astrologists. And it's worth remembering General Boris Ratnikov, who is well known for his distant scanning Madeleine Albright's brain. And this way you find out her pathological hate for the Slavs. So ironically, that the most popular current singer in Russia, glorifying the war and Russian nationalism, calls himself shaman. So this is his stage name. Well, but Putin, close connection with the Russian Orthodox Church is well known, and he always promotes himself as a true Christian. So how it can correlate with mysticism? Pretty easily, because the Russian Orthodox Church is very flexible, I would say. And at first, the Russian Church treated Dugin with caution and criticized his occultism and magical imperialism. But look at what we have now. So this is the World Russia People's Council that I mentioned before, October 28, 2023. And we see Putin and Dugin with these icons in the background articulated his occult geopolitical dualism with a central role of Russia's supremacy over other countries and other nations, followed up by Putin's speech about the essence of the Russian world. And both were totally supported by the Russian Orthodox Church. So recently I read Dugin's interview about Dostoevsky, one of his favorite writers. And Dostoevsky was intrigued by the dark side of humans, about this black hole every person has inside. And Dugin took this idea and went further. He spoke about anthropological abyss. He also brought on board the ideas of German philosophers Martin Heidegger and Arnold Gehlen, and admitted he was always followed the voice of the abyss. A man, he declared, stands by two legs on the abyss, and every thought rests not on the other thought, but on the abyss, so on the madness. And the deepness means abyss, he argued. And Eurasianism is the deepest philosophy because it deals with the abyss. And the other feature of abyss and deepness, Dugin emphasized, is that it has nothing to do with any morals or any ethics. So mankind standing on the edge of the abyss, on the edge of destruction, is the best that can happen to it. So maybe that's why current Russian Eurasianists are glorifying war and death and ultimate battle of one civilization against the other, it's like a total decadence. Well, and the staff of apparatus of the president throw up their hands, stating that, well, we have experts, we have executors, but we don't have ideologies, especially those who speak out in the right way. So we have no other choice than working with the right-wing conservatives. It's wartime, thus we need aggressive ones. And unfortunately, it's true. Well, it's all about making sense of a long-term war, and Russian expansion. You don't really need ideology to explain and justify long-term war, like a blitzkrieg. But if you are enlarging a long-term war, and Putin is getting ready for a long-term war, so you need this ideology. And we can witness day by day how Eurasianism in its current form affects Russian policy. And unfortunately, the logic of this philosophy does not leave us any chance for optimism, at least at this point. So that's what I wanted to share with you. If you have questions, please welcome. Yeah, please.
The whole thing starts in the